Hey there, internets. Welcome to Expired Films. My name is Kevin, and today we're going to be looking at two different things. The first is the Kodak35 camera and Lomography's Phantom 8, which is an 8 ISO black and white Kino film, and I think you'll find both of them pretty interesting. So recently, the family of one of my friends gifted me this camera. So this is a Kodak 35. This particular camera was made in 1947. I was able to figure that out a couple of ways. So normally where the serial number would be placed on the lens for lenses of this type, there isn't one here. However, the fact that the fastest aperture is f4.5, that the knobs are a gray or white plastic instead of black, and the shutter type, this is the flash diaphragmatic shutter, all of these point to 1947 as the manufacture date. This camera didn't sell, this whole line actually didn't sell super well. They were pretty pricey. So in 1938, when this line began, this particular version of the camera was $33.50. That doesn't sound like a whole lot, but if you compare that for the changes in monetary value, that's between $500 and $3,000 in today's currency values, depending on whether you're looking at commodity price or income value or things like that. So it was a pretty pricey camera. It takes 35mm film canisters, and this was one of Kodak's first big pushes for that. Previously, 35mm film was using a paper-backed format, which is something I've never shot. So, the Kodak 35 has a few interesting things which at the time were considered features, but now I would kind of consider bugs. If you look at this lens style, you can see that it is in fact very similar to a large format lens. So I have here a Kodak Ektar 127mm focal length lens, and you can see that these two share some visual similarities. So the shutter is located here in the kind of 10 o'clock position, which would be typical for other Kodak large format lenses. The shutter speed is set with a dial on the front. This has a kind of reduced shutter speed compared to my large format lens. We have a timer, a bulb, 1/25th, 50th, 100, and 1/50th of a second. So those are kind of radically limited. I think I have twice as many settings on the large format lens. Aperture is set with this sliding gauge here, and the fastest aperture is f4.5, and the smallest aperture is f16. There is a timer notch here. On this particular one, I haven't got that working just quite yet, but this would have been for self-timing photos. And overall, it looks quite like a large format lens. So one of the reasons this didn't sell well compared to its competitors would be the viewfinder. So this is an approximate viewfinder. Obviously, it's not an SLR, so you're not seeing through the lens. So as a result, you have zone focusing here. On my version of this is actually incredibly free and rotates easily. The minimum focal distance here is about 3.5 feet to 50 and then infinity. I can't open this up because I currently have film in it because I'm still shooting with it, but I would like to tell you a little bit about it and the film that I chose to shoot it in. So the film is actually an integral part of this camera, and it makes it a bit difficult to test because you cannot cock the shutter unless the film sprockets are moving over two wound gears. So the film is auto-cocked as you advance the film. Kodak must have been pretty concerned about double exposures because there are two features, that being one of them, which prevent double exposures. The other is this button here on top. So after you take a shot, the film advance knob is actually locked. You have to depress this button, which frees up this mechanism. That allows you to advance the film and cocks the shutter. So if you're doing a basic function test, you have to remove the back of the camera and kind of roll those sprockets by hand to cock the camera and make sure that everything is working appropriately. That seems like a strange choice to me, especially because most of these lenses could otherwise be cocked from the outside of the camera. So I find that a little bit strange. But that was the choice they made, and it's one of the reasons I think this camera probably did less well than some of its German competitors at the time. So the film that I shot for this was Lomography's Phantom 8, which is out of focus for you there. There we go. Which is an ultra-low 8 ISO black and white film. I actually really enjoyed taking this out. So because the film was such a low ISO, I knew it was very likely going to be longer exposures than I am steady for. And so I took a tripod and a cable release. There's just the standard cable release socket here. I have a screw in there right now to protect it, and took those out to do some shooting. It was actually very pleasant to shoot. The camera came with a small rangefinder adapter, which worked quite a bit differently than this one that I have on my large format 4x5. The same basic premise is there, where you basically have two windows and you are in some way lining up the picture. So in this one, you're looking at a blue and a yellow frame and you're matching them up to then look at the wheel and see how far it is. On the Kodak version, you have a line that divides the visual plane and you're just moving two images, and so you're truing up two parts of that image, and then above it, it shows you approximately how far that is, and then you can set the zone focusing on the camera. Thankfully, the previous owners were either very careful when they took this lens apart and cleaned it, or never did, because the zone focusing seemed pretty close. Any softness that you might see on some of the images is my fault, because other ones are spot on. So I was pretty impressed with that. So in general, this was a slower method of shooting. It actually reminded me quite a lot of shooting large format. The only which I've done is the Camerodactyl 4x5. The only difference being that you don't have film holders and dark slides to handle, and you can have more shots. So I had the Lomography film has generally around 36 exposures, which is much more than I take out when shooting any kind of large format, and probably most folks. So other than that portion of it, it was very similar. I was using an external meter, measuring the distance, then converting my exposure for the low ISO of 8, setting the lens manually, whether that's aperture, shutter speed, all of that, making my shot, and then going. A few of these I bracketed because I wasn't quite sure whether the shutter speed was as indicated. I did notice a tendency to overexposure, but some of that was my fault. I assumed that the shutter speed might be off, and I assumed in the wrong direction. And so some of the shots were overexposed because I was leaving the shutter open longer than I ought to have. The basic markings on the camera for shutter speed kind of also inhibit your ability to do that. So playing with the shutter speed and the aperture to get the correct exposure is just something you'll have to do on a fully manual camera like this. So I'd like to now take you through a few of the shots from this weekend and show you how the Lomography Phantom 8 film looks through this camera, and hopefully you'll find them as enjoyable as I did in making them. So while I was traveling around my town, there is an old gas station which has been lovingly restored. It's right off of a side street from a main road, and I'd realized I'd been wanting to shoot it for some time, and I've never stopped here to shoot it, and I thought this would be sort of the perfect opportunity to do so. So this is the old restored Esso gas station, and I took a few photos here that I think you'll find enjoyable. Whether it was a function of the film, I've had other people note that there is a similarity to the way infrared film looks. There was a tendency to blow out the highlights, and that could have been my exposure, or it could just be a tendency of the film. Either way, it's something to look forward to. As you can see, the sticker on the front of the instrument on the right that says Esso is nearly illegible, and that could have been a combination of my DSLR scanning, the film, or the overexposure. But either way, it's something to be considerate of. I took a few shots of this painted advertisement on the side of the gas station, a Coca-Cola advertisement, and I wanted to play with some color filters, so I took a few at different exposures, and I also used a red filter. The filtered shots generally didn't come out. I corrected for the fact that there would be a filter factor there of about 2.5 stops, but the shots that I took with a red filter just didn't quite come out the way I wanted to look, and this was the best of those logo shots. So here's a wider angle of that little ad. You can see there's one on each side of the building. I did discover that the film, the camera's angle of view is tighter than the viewfinder would otherwise lead you to believe. So all of the shots that the framing worked out for most of them, but I was expecting wider shots than I got. And that could just be the fact that I've been shooting a lot of pinhole photos lately, and many of those are ultra wide, 100 degrees to 170 degrees, and some of the homemade cameras are even wider than that. So I may have just broken my instinct for the wideness of camera, but I was using the viewfinder, and it did sort of lead me astray, but generally not enough to lose a subject, but something to also be considered about when using this old camera. I've taken lately to using the Randonautica app to take me to random locations when I'm having a hard time thinking of things to shoot, and so I was using it today also. There was an interesting shed that it brought us to, and whenever you kind of use the Randonautica app, it gives you a radius, and whether or not you find the arguments behind how that app work compelling, I just like to shake myself out of the mold and not shoot the same stuff all the time. So I found this interesting shed pretty near to where the Randonautica app sent us, and I took a few shots here. This one, I really like the tonality of the image. I really like the way it came out. I took 2 shots here at slightly different exposures, but this one I still think was the better of the 2. This is the same building that we just saw. On the left corner of the previous image, there was some damage to the cement block. This is about as close as I could reasonably get my tripod to the wall. I used the rangefinder, and the camera was set at about 4 feet. I didn't really go any closer because I wasn't sure exactly how fussy the camera might be for distance. This was almost an entirely white shot with just kind of shadows and general texture, so it was a little bit more difficult to tease out in post, and it's sort of a moodier image than the scene was while I was there. One of the maybe fun synchronicities that came about when using Randonautica, they recommend that you view positive things and life-changing things, and I suspect all of that is woo, but I still do the intention setting anyway because rituals are important. And my intention for this one was death, and interestingly enough, it brought us to a headstone manufacturing company where headstones are engraved for cemeteries. So I went ahead and took a shot here from across the road. This was one of the first shots that I did in direct sunlight, and I was expecting longer exposures, but I think this was shot at 1/25 of a second, which is still fast enough to avoid vehicles and other things. So even though it's an ultra low ISO film, with enough light and some correct apertures, you're still going to have reasonably quick shutter speeds. I know from previous testing that I have a hard time holding the camera steady any slower than 1/60th of a second. If you haven't done that, I really recommend taking a DSLR out and starting at the top range of about maybe 1/250th, assuming that you don't have any tremors or any other issues that might inhibit your ability to hold a camera steady, and just take the same photo of the same thing with speed priority at every shutter speed you have until you get to an image which is unacceptably blurry. That is really useful information to have. I know that my cutoff point, my speed limit, if you will, is 1/60th, and this was going to be 1/25th, so that was just a bit slower than I could hold. So I'm glad that I had the tripod with me, and all of these shots were tripod shot as a result. But there was a fun synchronicity between the intent of death and finding ourselves at a headstone manufacturing facility. So here's another wider shot that I took while we were out. This was just sort of a field near a few houses that were for sale. I pulled over, and something was interesting to me about the pylons between the clear cut, and so I wanted to stop and take some photos here. This is another few shots where I used a red filter, and the results were just kind of not pleasing to me from what I liked. I'm not sure whether it was the light or me just getting used to the exposure, because this is one of the first photos that I took, but there doesn't seem to be a huge tonal range here. The blacks are a bit crushed, and the highlights were almost blown out. So there seems to be a pretty narrow range where things are at their best, but with some familiarity, I think that you can definitely tease some good shots out of this film. This was the very first shot from the roll. So normally I like to take a burn shot, but since this camera requires that you take a photo to cock the shutter. I didn't get a decent one from this roll. I just wasted that burn shot inside to get the film advanced. So this was the very first shot that I took. I was about 7 feet away from this object, and this was shot wide open at 4.5. So there's a little bit of foreground background separation. As you can see, the highlights from the cement and on the metal casing are pretty close to white. And that was pretty typical of, I think, the shots that we got today. Overall, I really enjoyed shooting this Kodak 35 camera, and the 8 ISO film was surprisingly easy to shoot. I would recommend both to you. I'd be interested to find out if any of you are shooting any of these older full manual cameras. I saw this described on one website as a Fallout looking camera, and that is not wrong. I was pleased that I already had experience with Kodak large format lenses, because that meant there was almost no learning curve at all to using one of these. So if you haven't used a lens like this, or you haven't quite managed a foray into large format, these can be picked up on eBay reasonably cheaply. The quality, of course, may vary. They haven't been made for quite some time now, pushing 60 years. So you can get them anywhere from $20 to $135 is from what I saw from a quick perusal. But I think that it would definitely be worth your time if you were interested in using a lens such as this. It would be cheaper actually to purchase this than it was to get my large format lens. So to find out whether that's the kind of shooting you would enjoy, this could be a reasonable first step. So thanks for tuning in to Expired Films. This has been sort of a roll review and a look at a camera, the Kodak 35, the original f4.5 before it was added an in-camera rangefinder, and Lomography's Fantôme 8 ultra-low ISO black and white Kino film. So thanks for tuning in. I'm Kevin, this is Expired Films, and I will see you folks shortly.